Welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. Today is our last episode in our environmental sustainability series on Third Floor Views. All of our April episodes have focused on exciting local work that is being done in the environmental field, from sustainable shopping with the Fulfillery to green builders, Project Clean Stream, and citizen science. If you missed an episode, make sure that you check out the podcast page on chesapeakefamily.com. Today, though, we are talking about pollinator gardens, what they are, why they are important, and how to make your own. And joining us is Meenal Harankhedkar, who is Director of Horticulture at London Town and Gardens, and Ginger Woolridge, a landscape designer and consultant and co-author of Essential Native Trees and Shrubs for Eastern US, the Guide to Creating a Sustainable Landscape. Thank you so much to both of you for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Janet.
To our viewers, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section and we'll get to those as we can. So let's jump in. First, I just want to talk about what is a pollinator garden and why is it important? Meenal, let's start with you. What is a pollinator garden?
So pollinator garden is with a focus of inviting wildlife in your garden. And it seems more complicated than it is. It is actually very simple and easy and hands-on to do one. And I think a pollinator garden, sometimes people think of it for sun only, but there are ample plants you can have in shade and sun, and it's quality versus quantity. I think that's the key when you think of a pollinator garden.
That's helpful to know because I know so many people's yards, have various aspects and it's like, oh no, I have full sun or I have full shade and I can never do anything, but that's not true. So that's really helpful to know. Ginger, could you speak to why we would want to invite wildlife or pollinators into our yard? Why is that a good thing or why is that important?
Well, most of us, I would say the most alluring thing for most people is bird life. We've lost about 30% of the North American bird life in the last 40 years. And there's worldwide species lost in flora, in bird life and mammals, and especially in insects. And what the native plants provide is they're the only being that can take the sun and turn it into food. So our insects specialize, their babies, the larvae of the pollinators, require specific genus and sometimes species to eat because plants protect themselves with toxins. And this is sort of like the well-known example is the monarch needs the genus of milkweed. So if we don't have a particular native plant that co-evolved with those insects, their larvae have nothing to eat. And to carry that a step further, to raise a clutch of chickadees, there's a study by Doug Tallamy and his associates that says that they require 10,000 caterpillars to raise a nest of chickadees.
That's a lot of caterpillars.
So we need our native plant material to support the young side of the pollinator, because the caterpillar really is an entirely the metamorphosis into a butterfly, for instance, is truly a miracle, and they just have different food needs.
Right. So let's say you've decided that you are ready for a garden, maybe specifically a pollinator garden. What would you say are the basic steps in planning, planting, and then maintaining a pollinator garden? And Meenal, I'll start with you again here. So how do you do this? How do you actually go about creating a pollinator garden?
I think the first things first is knowing your planting zone, your plant hardiness zone. And that's really easy to do. There are many resources. You could start with the extension websites. For example, the University of Maryland will be able to tell you which planting zone you're in. But it's a lot of times we just think of light, is it sun or shade? But the moisture conditions, the soil type, what are your existing plants? I think making sure that the new plants you're bringing in are companion plants with those, that's really key. So I think knowing your habitat first is essential. And then what are you filling the gaps with will be key. And a lot of times, most nurseries have what we call as nativers, which are actually hybrids of native plants. And sadly, most nurseries carry those versus straight species of natives. So I think it's really important to know when you're looking for those plants, you're bringing in nativers or natives, and then how will they adapt to where you bring them in. So light conditions, soil conditions, your canopy layers, and also knowing quality versus quantities. How many planting in drifts, for example, is preferred when you're doing a pollinator garden versus just doing 2 or 3 plants together. So think about larger quantities and repetition to bring in pollinators. I think those are some key things that most people tend to forget.
That's really helpful to think about. Ginger, when you are thinking about a garden, and I'm thinking specifically about your book, you talk a lot about trees and shrubs. I think shrubs are sometimes things that people aren't necessarily thinking about when they're planting a garden, but with a pollinator garden, shrubs can be such a valuable resource. Could you talk just a little bit about how would you go about picking out maybe a shrub, and what role would that play in a pollinator garden?
Well, and just another thing is trees. I mean, people might not think about trees flowering.
Right.
Maples flower very early. The oaks are giving a lot of people allergies right now, but the oaks provide so much more pollinator support than any other plant, and as do willows, cherries. There's some plants that we call keystone plants. But in terms of shrubs, what I love about shrubs is so many people are trying to reduce their lawn, and lawn is not native, and really doesn't have much life and doesn't support pollinators very well. So shrubs are a great way to eat up lawn, and they provide cover for birds, and provide places for the insects to hide too. So and our native shrub palette and tree palette too is really extraordinary. I mean, in the world, the Eastern woodland, which is all of the Eastern states, plus it goes west of the Mississippi. This whole Eastern woodland, a lot of the plants in it live in all different places in it. And through the eons, they've been south, they've been north. Pawpaws will grow in Ontario. I mean, so a lot of our plants are very, very flexible, our native plants, and they're also really beautiful. I have native azaleas growing now. They're deciduous, but they are unbelievable in their colors. The range is incredible. So you can really use these plants for beauty, as well as attracting pollinators. And you just have to be a little careful of the light and the moisture that Meenal discussed. But they can be a real treat.
So then, Ginger, how would you, if we have this huge palette to choose from, how would you go about making some of those decisions? And Meenal mentioned, make sure you know what you're dealing with in terms of what does your backyard actually look like. Are there other things that you should be thinking about as well in terms of making these decisions?
Well, I think, you can sort of break down some of the stuff. Like a lot of our plants don't, especially like Western light, which is hot in the summer. So if they get Eastern light, maybe they do better. Your soil type can matter. Most of these plants are pretty tough, and pretty adaptable. But I know in our book, we have a cross-reference guide, so you can pick out what size, what your light is, and then cross-reference it with other items. And there are a lot of websites you can use to see if they, we can talk about sources of information at some point, but there's an awful lot of help in taking your site and deciding what will work there.
Meenal, when you are going about this, maybe coming from a public garden perspective, what are you thinking about when you are choosing plants? What are things, or maybe that you're thinking about when you're choosing a plant in your own personal garden?
Sure. I think public gardens are 4 seasons mostly. And that's what London Town is. We are a 4-season woodland garden. And a lot of time when you think of pollinators, or when people think of planting, it's April and it's spring. And our focus is color in spring and summer. But I think thinking of those 4 seasons, especially very importantly, late fall, late winter and early spring when the insects are just hatching, and thinking of what plants would be feeding them is really key. So I think it's really essential to think about ephemerals, which we call as plants that grow and die back quickly in spring before the canopy layers are out, are key. I think a really good one is a wild ginger, which is asarum. There are many other woodland ground covers that are important for these insects. And then thinking through late heat, summer and fall and winter is key. For example, London Town has both fall and spring camellias. There are another one is sweet boxwood. There are many layers through the 4 seasons that you can have to keep the life cycles going. I think thinking of what the life cycle is key versus only imagining a butterfly coming in your garden. You know, what happens to the butterflies when it lays an eggs, and all of that is a whole complete cycle. That's key.
When you are going out and actually purchasing plants and shopping, what are some things that you should watch out for? And Meenal, you had mentioned some terms like a nativar and cultivars. Could you just talk about a few things that maybe people should be aware of when they're shopping, whether it be different terms they should know or things to watch out for in terms of like maybe the health or quality of a plant?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing you want to stay away from is if you see a flower that has very bright colors, and I think I'll give you an example, echinacea. Echinaceas are sold, there are double or triple layers of flowers. They're bright and bolder colors. Some have really attractive names. I think those are the ones that serve more function of aesthetics, visual appeal, but not so much as function. They're not really good food sources versus the, a native echinacea might be. So I think of simpler single flowers versus complex double layer of flowers. Those are much beneficial. And thinking of, I think hydrangeas are a good example. Mop head hydrangeas, which are these beautiful blue, they look more abundant versus, they have more sterile flowers, meaning they don't have anything in there for pollinators, but they're good for aesthetics. If you're thinking of a landscape for color, that's good. But if you're putting in hydrangeas like that, I think put one that is a native hydrangea, which has more fertile flowers, meaning it has the pollen that the insects need. So I think my rule of thumb is there's nothing wrong with adding color. If you think of one fertile flower, you could add 2 sterile flowers in there. So you could mix color, but definitely look for a plant that has fertile flowers. Stay away from loud colors and double flowers. And the simpler the name, the simpler the variety. And that's probably what you should be going for.
It's a good trick. Ginger, when you're shopping, is there anything that you would recommend that people sort of look out for or be aware of?
Well, there's a pesticide called a neonicotinoid. And which means new nicotine-like pesticide. That's what some of the big box stores, I think, still use them. I think we've had some efforts to outlaw them in Maryland, but I'm not sure they've gotten through. So that's important because they'll kill the insects. So, yeah. And I think it's important too to think that, if people, I also think we just have to be careful not to be killing the insect. If you look around, everything's green in the summer. We don't really have big insect problems. So, and other things, if you have a cultivated variety of a native plant, it's actually with the trees and shrubs, there's not that much difference in how attractive they are to a pollinator. It's really more in the smaller plants because they've been changed more, whether they have a double flower so that the insect can't get in to pollinate, or their leaf color has been changed and it's no longer attractive to the larva doesn't want to eat it. So
okay. That's helpful to know. So then people need to be a little bit more careful with their research, or just know to be aware of that when they're shopping for flowers, but then they can rely on trees and shrubs as being a little bit more true to the original form.
One other thing is that a lot of these plants are flowering right now, but if you're going to be away for the summer and not watering carefully, you may want to wait until fall to plant. I don't know how Meenal probably does an awful lot of planting all year round. So she may be better at discussing this, but I would rather plant in the fall.
What would you recommend, Meenal?
I think Ginger brings about a really excellent point is, we think of, in pollinator gardens, you think of annuals or perennials and the low to the ground flowers for quick color, but trees and shrubs are essential. That's your canopy. You're building a sustainable habitat. And I think they go hand in hand. So just don't stick to only perennials, but think of layers above it. And fall is my choice too. I think you get more bare root plants. They get a nice window to get established versus spring when, like Ginger said, if you don't water, then they're getting into drought. So fall is preferred. You could do it in spring too. But I think for trees and shrubs, I would prefer fall. And then for perennials, I think ground cover, spring is also nice.
So we've talked a little bit about this, but I think for a lot of people, you're hearing a lot about native plants, and especially when you're trying to attract wildlife and pollinators. Do you have to make the choice between natives or not natives? Can you sprinkle natives with non-natives? Will that scare away some of the wildlife? Do you have to commit fully to native plants? And it sounds like there's a lot of give and take and there's a lot of wiggle room. So what are your opinions, Ginger? Do you think that you can mix the two and still be successful, or is it really you need to commit and move forward?
I really think if we can do things like limit lawn. I mean, I have non-natives here that still provide services on my property. Because there's still, the birds still need trees to protect them and to be up in. And so I've got, and I have a Japanese maple that I put the Christmas lights in every year. So it's fine. I have boxwood. I have, what else? There's a crepe myrtle here that I'm not crazy about, but still, I think just do what you can. I know Doug Tallamy would recommend like 70% native, but if you have some trees, that helps a lot in that. And I mean, I think a combination is nice. I think we have it back in the 1600s when we were importing new plants, because I mean, we all like something new, whether it's a new kind of design or whatever. Now what is sort of unusual is to go to a store and find native plants, because 25% of, they said that one study said 25% of the natives of the plants in a nursery are native. So 75% are not. Yeah.
Right.
But they're more and more. So
what are your thoughts, Meenal, on natives and non-natives, and thinking like you are bringing a really interesting perspective because you're coming at it from a public garden, and your purpose is not always just to bring in wildlife. So do you see lots of pollinators? Are you seeing wildlife in your public gardens, and how do non-natives, what role do they play?
So yes, I think there is and a lot of misconceptions sometimes. When you think of non-native, it just makes you think invasive. And London town, for example, is 80% exotic and 20% natives. We are being conscious about adding natives when we get closer to the water, closer to the rain gardens, things and peripheries that we can protect better. But I think there are many guides online. You can go and find out what is a noxious weed, what is a weed, and what is a non-native. I think if you do plant responsibly and pick a non-native that's not going to be invasive in your garden and not going to be carcinogenic to birds or those important things like that, then that's a good choice. And that's how you could combine the non-natives with the natives. But if you are trying to establish a sustainable habitat, I would say 70 native and then 30 non-native would be better, because they just get established better and they have a longer lifespan. But it doesn't hurt to add a non-native that's not invasive and that can enhance. In fact, there's still current research going on. Are non-natives really impacting the wildlife, the bees and the insect? And there's some research I was reading about that talks that they are beneficial to broad spectrum insects, meaning those are not specialized. They also act as buffers and fill in the gaps where natives are not flowering. So there is, I think, benefits and pros and cons for both. But for your backyard garden, if you're choosing a non-native, I think there's guides you can find out whether it's invasive or not. And that's the easiest way to do it. And UMD extension, most extension websites would be able to tell you what is specifically invasive in your neighborhood or your locality.
One thing we haven't really talked about yet is size of yard. Do you have to have a big space to have a pollinator garden be successful? Or can you pull it off in a really small space? Could you even maybe find a way to make container gardening work and bring in pollinators? And Meenal, I'll start with you.
Absolutely. I think there's, keep it simple. You can do it in a small container. For example, you put in companion plants like basil or marigold and add some cosmos in there. You have pollinator garden right there, a milkweed. I think the basic essential ones that hummingbirds might like or bees might like could easily go in a container garden. I don't think it's size, it's the quantity of flowers a plant makes, and the quality will be more crucial than what size of yard or a container you're looking for.
Just to change topics a little bit, our viewers are mostly families or even educators, and they're working with children. What tips or tricks do either of you have for engaging children in gardening? And Ginger, I'll start with you. What can you do to draw kids into this activity?
Well, I think on my property, I have 2 mini plots, a mini meadow that I'm experimenting with, and then a plot of just milkweed. And they attract the milkweed. Well, the meadow plants attract so many insects. And if you can have like milkweed, and children can see the weed, they can literally see the eggs being laid by the monarch. And the Mrs. Monarch comes up now looking pretty beat, because that's the long leg of the journey, or a couple journeys. And they're really battered, and you can explain, these insects have come a really long way, and you can watch them lay their eggs. And then, hopefully some of the eggs aren't eaten, covered by birds or anything. And you can literally find chrysalises. And I think that really, as they develop and get bigger and change color, and then the butterfly comes up, that's pretty exciting. And also a pond in a garden can help in that way too, with animals and attracting kids.
That's a great idea.
Getting their attention. Yeah.
Meenal, from with the gardens, what do you do to get kids more engaged and more excited about being out there?
So public programs are the ones that bring in children to the gardens, and they go through the ornamental and woodland gardens, and there's many hands-on activities that are planned throughout the year. But I think what Ginger said is really key, is the hands-on, or noticing a life cycle, whether it's life cycle of an insect or even life cycle of a plant, starting from a seed. For example, you could start with a sunflower seed, see the seed to a seedling to a sunflower, and the life cycle of the insect with it. I think those two probably get kids most excited when they see a start to finish and a whole complete cycle. So anything hands-on, small, and that's why I think container gardens would be perfect for children to get involved, because it's small scale and they feel ownership and getting something like that established, which is key.
Yeah, anytime you can get little fingers digging in dirt, that's always
and it's instant reward.
Yes.
If you see an earthworm, if you see a caterpillar,
yeah, absolutely. So for new gardeners, what are some tips and tricks that you would recommend to get started, or maybe things to watch out for, pitfalls to common, mistakes to avoid, or common pitfalls that you want to stay away from? Meenal, I'll start with you.
I think with native plants, you already started with the success story, because they establish well. There's less maintenance required, meaning they are accustomed to the soil type here. They require less water. They can tolerate drought. So you're already starting off on a pretty successful, side there. And the mistakes to avoid would be just not planning the quantity of plants you're putting in. Meaning, if you're planting milkweed, maybe you need to think of drift. Maybe think of height and layers that you're adding. So you don't just have a tall layer and nothing on the ground. So I think thinking of height, thinking of quantity, and like I said, it's really already easy because they are accustomed to the soil type and the water conditions.
Mm-hmm. Ginger, what about you? When working with beginner gardeners, maybe some of your clients, what sort of tips or tricks do you suggest, or things that you recommend that they avoid?
Well, one thing with tree placement and shrub placement, and we have drawings in our book to show the scale of a plant over time, because it's really easy to not place a tree correctly. I mean, I've done it myself. It's just so easy because you just can't imagine how big it will get, or you don't want to plant it too close to your house. I think that siting your plants really carefully. And another thing, we talk about these invasive plants that are still being sold, English ivy that's killing the canopy trees and stuff like that. But some natives are fairly aggressive too. I mean, no native is usually considered invasive. But some of them, like if you were going to plant a milkweed garden like I have, you want to contain that because milkweed can be pretty aggressive. It's great to have, but you just need to plan for that. So that's another thing to watch out for. Most of our natives are not all that aggressive, but some are.
That's good to know. My last question for both of you are just suggested resources for people. So as we discussed, there's so many things to be thinking about, but at the end of the day, you're just putting plants in dirt and something wonderful would happen. But are there things that you suggest that are useful, either places to go, maybe London town would be a lovely place to go and see the gardens, or books to read, like Ginger, your books, or other than favorite blogs or online resources? Both of you have mentioned the county extension as being a really great place to visit. What are some great places that you would recommend that people check out? Ginger, I'll start with you.
Well, one of the things to understand the whole native importance of natives, this is Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Best Hope, which is extraordinarily important to understand. Then this is actually a pretty good book, Native Plants of the Southeast, because this is by a fellow, a really good, Larry Mellichamp is a really good author on this. And he's sort of, it's not as in-depth as what Tony and I did in our book, but he gives a star system. So when you see 4 stars, just get that plant. Then this is another book that Tallamy wrote with Rick Dark. If somebody has a woodland garden, a living landscape, or you want to make your garden a woodland garden. Of course, this is Tony's in my book. And then a couple of other resources that I like are the Northern Virginia Master Gardeners website, which is nvmg.org. Tallamy's website is extremely helpful, homegrownnationalpark.org. And if you want, I can make a list of these.
Yeah, we'll definitely post them along with this video on our website, so we can post some of these resources because they sound great.
And of course, right here is London Town is a gorgeous garden, right on the South River. If you want to go to do strictly native, Adkins Arboretum on the Eastern Shore. Mount Cuba Center Garden is an old DuPont estate near Wilmington that's really wonderful. For really terrific, more formal design, Dumbarton Oaks in DC is really great. And the Maryland Native Plant Society has lists where you can get native plants.
Oh, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
What about you, Meenal? What are some suggested resources that you might recommend to people?
Well, I think I'll start with Ginger's book. I think that is one of the best native plants book I read. And it's a great picture guide. I think it gives you scale of the plant and the habit. So I'm a visual learner. It helps a lot to see pictures and what mature height they'll get at. And then, of course, London Town, we're a 4 seasons garden. I'd be happy to give you a tour anytime. And it's a garden where, we have sun sections, the woodland garden, which is full shade to dapple shade. There are 3 rain gardens you can have a look at, but anything you can see hands-on and experience and see in a garden growing, I think that's the best learning that can happen. American Public Gardens, APGA, I think is a great resource for many different gardens locally and nationally. American Horticulture Society is also a good website. They have a location in River Farm, Virginia, but they had a great resource for understanding landscape plants. The other thing I would mention is Unity Gardens. On the board with them, and they are one organization. If you're thinking of creating a native garden for your local church or your neighborhood, I think they give out 2 grants annually. And it's a very easy grant process that helps and aids in buying plants, especially native plants. They solely focus only on native plants. The other very easy resource is easy to forget is garden clubs. I think there are many garden clubs in every county, and those garden clubs connect you to other umbrella organizations, and they are a great resource to begin with. And it's a good community to connect with. So garden clubs are one of my favorite and easy to connect to places.
That's a great suggestion. I have one, I know I said that was our last question, but I have one more question that's coming from a viewer. And someone asked about clarifying the water needs for native plants. Do native plants need more water or less water than sort of your average plant? Does it really depend? What kind of watering needs are we looking at with native plants? And Meenal, I'll start with you.
Well, native plants, I think, are accustomed to your native area, and so their water needs are, lesser compared to an exotic plants. I would always say a native plant, the best advantage of growing something native is they won't go in, they can tolerate drought conditions better. They can, high foot traffic areas, they'll be able to tolerate that too. So you already have an added advantage with a native plant. Not saying that you don't need to water, but they can survive in drought-like conditions, or if there's a period of, where they don't get watered versus something that's exotic and that probably more tender and needs more attention.
Well, that's really helpful to know. And I think that's, again, one of the big benefits of natives is that they grew up here and they're used to it here. So they're used to our climate. So it's a little bit less work on our part. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to both of you. Thank you to Meenal Harankhedkar, and thank you to Ginger Woolridge, and all of the expertise that you're able to bring to us today. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners as well. Make sure that you visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for local, up-to-date information on home, health, and living for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in both video and podcast format. I'm Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thank you so much.